There are some things that are not in this bill that ought to have been in this bill. I will mention only 4. We've got to let people get lean, mean, and efficient. Remember, our friends in the Ohio House said no to your costs. Number 2, we have a provision in current Ohio law that says whenever there are 2 companies in Ohio that make a given product, we have to accept the bid from the Ohio company. Now, ladies and gentlemen, in my real life, I'm an antitrust lawyer. That deals with the law of competition. Folks, you don't get much competition with 2 bidders. It's called a duopoly. That is one step short of a monopoly. All of you know that a monopoly is bad, and a duopoly is only slightly less bad. Director Molitoris, to her eternal credit, had in this bill a provision that would have excised this protectionist provision, which the statewide transportation task force identified as the first reason why salt prices were out of line this past year. Unless we're prepared to take on the forces of duopoly, the forces of monopoly, the forces of protectionism, unless we're prepared to do that, we are going to have a problem in this state. The governor of the state of Ohio has one of the most meaningful phrases that I've ever heard, and boy, do I agree with it. Living within our means and investing in what matters. Amen. What a grand statement. Why then are we passing a budget that has DPS line items for seatbelt education programs, motorcycle safety programs, extra OMVI advertising? Is this living within our means and investing in what matters? Are we going to get them back to their core mission of public safety? Or are we going to let them continue to be an adjunct of the Department of Education? We missed the opportunity to take scalpel-like cuts to their line items so that they live by Governor Strickland's credo. We, in this bill today, are giving them 1%. When come July 1, they were going to get the same 3% that they always had. That is in effect, a tripling of their fee. So when you see the gas prices start going up, because the governor wanted to give them 0 and the House was willing to give them a paltry 0.5%. When you see those retail prices going up, thank Governor Ted Strickland for raising the price of gas. Because that is what we're doing, folks. We're raising the price of gas. You can bend over and pat yourself on the back about how we ducked a $5 registration fee. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I predict people are going to pay a lot more than that at the pump. If you don't think that's going to have an impact at the pump, again, I welcome you back to economics class.
Question is, shall the bill pass? Chair recognizes Senator Seitz.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would the sponsor be so kind as to yield to a question?
The gentleman does yield. Would you please ask your question through the chair, Senator Seitz?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm simply, as an ardent opponent of unfunded mandates, my question is, who pays for this and what is the cost of the required vaccination?
Senator Case, do you understand his question?
Yes, Mr. President. Senator Seitz, I don't know.
But we all have a tendency, depending on which side of the aisle we're on, either to think the bill is great or the bill is lousy, and the truth, ladies and gentlemen, is always somewhere in between. We find that lineups are conducted by police departments, and due to no malice on the part of the police, but rather the inadvertent power of suggestion that is sometimes used in conducting lineups, we find that subtle hints are used to get witnesses to identify the wrong guy. And so we came up with a method. It is not micromanagement of the police system. It is a method of doing lineups in a blind way. And it can be done as simply as $1.19. You put in the pictures in a manila folder, such as the kind like this that we carry around all the time, and you sequentially show the witness the pictures. Even a police department that has nobody else in it except for Andy Griffith and Barney Fife can do that without any added cost. And that will increase the confidence that we have in lineups, that the right person is actually being picked out. So if the police want to grumble about a solution that costs them $1.19, I think they're barking up the wrong tree. Now, whether it is rhetoric or not to call it cap and tax, the CBO called it an increase in price of carbon-based energy. I'm no scientist, but I do know that carbon-based energy includes oil, gasoline, ethanol, coal, biomass, practically everything we use now. The problem with the United States taking the lead here, and my friend from Cuyahoga County is correct, we are not actually the first. They've done it in Spain. They are doing this in the EU. But the problem is they're not doing it in China. I had dinner last night with somebody involved in the coal business who told me that China is building the equivalent of one coal-fired power plant per week. Cap and trade is not going to take place in China. The EU is doing it, but my friends, their economy is more sclerotic than ours. So that's certainly no example. The second best argument that I've heard for this is that, well, it was going to be a $1.6 trillion carbon tax, and now it's only $800 billion. Well, reminds me of something I heard recently, which is, please let's not tell anybody in Congress or the president what comes after trillion, because they throw numbers around up there and trillion is suddenly losing its currency as a big number. I don't know what comes after trillion, but I got a bad feeling we're about to find out. Now, finally, my colleagues, I would argue that the most fundamental reason to support the resolution before us today is that doing so would be consistent with what this body did in Senate Bill 221, our electric re-regulation bill. Do you remember how hard we fought collectively, led by our dear departed colleague Senator Schuler, to make sure that bill contained a cap that if electric prices got out of whack by using all the pretty little windmills and the solar panels and the newfangled shabobs, that if electric prices got out of whack by more than 3%, we were going to say, never mind, please burn the dirty old coal, because Bob and Betty Buckeye don't want to pay more than 3% more for their clean, green electric? That's what we fought for, and that's what we put in the bill, and that's Ohio law. Well, do you know, according to the Wall Street Journal, in the House Energy Committee, amendments were offered and rejected as follows. The first amendment said, we're going to suspend cap and trade if gas hits $5 a gallon. But the House of Representatives said no to that amendment. The next one said, we're going to suspend cap and trade if electricity prices rose 10% over the 2009 baseline. 10%, pretty generous. They were going to let everybody's electric bills go up 10% and still keep doing it. But that amendment was rejected. And then finally, an amendment was offered to suspend the program if unemployment rates hit 15%. And that amendment was tabled too. So I guess our friends in Congress are bound and determined to do cap and trade regardless of the unemployment rate, regardless of the price of a gallon of gasoline, and regardless of how much your electric bill goes up. I think that's irresponsible, and I think this body should send them a message, look no farther than Senate Bill 221 for the right way to do this. I urge passage. All this resolution says is, in the resolved clauses, when you get past all the pomp and circumstance, is simply that we reaffirm our residual and inviolable sovereignty under the 10th Amendment. We're a state and we have rights. That we are giving notice to the federal government to end federal mandates that are beyond the scope of the constitutionally delegated powers. Don't act in an unconstitutional manner. They can't anyway. And finally, that all compulsory federal legislation that directs states to comply under threat of civil or criminal penalty or sanction, or that requires states to enact legislation or lose federal funding, be prohibited or repealed. Now, that clause is directed not at federal legislation like OSHA and EPA that govern the conduct of private businesses and the conduct of commerce in the United States, that operate as a dictate on individuals and businesses and are therefore within the power of Congress to prescribe as a matter of their powers under the Commerce Clause. That provision is instead directed at legislation of this sort, where they say to the states, their partner, you will do it, you will change state law to do what we say, or I pull the trigger on your money. That sort of legislation is what this resolution is all about. The legislation that said, you will raise the drinking age to 21, or you will lose your money. That was interfering in a matter that had theretofore been understood to be a matter of the state to determine for itself the appropriate age at which people could begin to consume alcohol. But no, and frankly, this was our Republican colleagues. Don't think this is some partisan diatribe. That was our Republican colleagues in Congress that did that to us. I go back a long, long way with Bob Schuler and his family. Truly coming up in Hamilton County politics together. We have been friends for, I'm going to say, 30 years at least. And the resolution you so eloquently read, Mr. President, reminded me of one of my first encounters with Bob when he was on the Regional Planning Commission. And Bob, as has been said, was a good listener and also had a good sense of humor. And I was a young lawyer, and I was discharged by the managing partner of our firm to go up to the Regional Planning Commission and argue against platting a big new upscale subdivision that was going to have common collector lines on septic tanks, that was going to discharge the effluent from the septic tanks into a creek that ran through a nature preserve that the managing partner's wife was on the board of. So the job was make it very clear to the Regional Planning Commission, you cannot allow this subdivision because it would pollute the lovely California Woods Nature Preserve, and you got to go up there and make sure they shoot this subdivision down, even though that's the way they'd been building subdivisions in Hamilton County for years. Of course, they didn't realize that that was against all the rules of the OEPA, and so I was able to point out to my friends in Hamilton County that this really was not kosher, and it was a morning session, and I went into tremendous graphic detail about the effect of common collector lines and septic effluent running through the otherwise pristine creek. And Bob actually was the first time Regional Planning Commission ever shot down a subdivision on that basis, but Bob never let me forget about it because he said, Bill, I couldn't eat lunch that day. You were so graphic. And that was just typical of the kind of wry comment that Bob Schuler would make about the whole proceedings. He wasn't too interested in all the environmental detail, but he did get the graphic detail, and he reminded me constantly that I cheated him out of his lunch. And Bob also understood one other thing, because, you know, Sheila, we did hang around a lot up here, and he kept me out of trouble, and I kept him out of trouble, saved such trouble as we got in together. But Bob and I would hang around a lot up here in the evenings, and over those evenings, we got the occasion to fraternize and really get to know and have respect for members of the opposing party. History is important. These people understand it. They've managed to commercialize it in a viable way. And the major reason why this bill, I guess I'll do a John Boehner and show how heavy it is, this bill is this fat, is because we have, like the House, decided to bring Ohio into compliance with something called the MOVE Act, a federal law dealing with the voting rights of military and overseas voters. We also have come up with an idea allowing for the first time folks to declare a party affiliation on their part when they register to vote. Currently, there is no way for someone to declare a party affiliation when they register to vote for the first time. This is purely optional. We took an amendment this morning at the suggestion of the American Civil Liberties Union to make it crystal clear that it was optional. In fact, it will say party affiliation optional right on the form to relieve all doubt amongst those who can read. And so therefore we will give voters that opportunity. That frankly works for both this side of the aisle and this side of the aisle, as we will now be better able to target our new voters. Are they more likely to lean your way or my way? And I would be remiss if I didn't at least set the stage for the amendment. And I'm not filibustering, Mr. President. I'm simply waiting on the amendment. So I guess I am filibustering.
We're both waiting. Please continue.
Right. What I wanted to address is the last issue, which will be addressed by an amendment. And I guess we can make this lively, because this is an issue where I am more on the side of my Democratic colleagues than perhaps my own colleagues. Under current law, it is a misdemeanor of the first degree to stand inside 100 feet outside the polling place and hand out literature on behalf of your candidate or candidates. As Senator Miller so aptly observed this morning, this creates many practical difficulties. Number one, in many cases, 100 feet from the poll is in the middle of the street. And you know, when my dad was mad at me, he always used to say, "Why don't you go out and play in the heavy traffic?" Well, that is what Ohio law says at many polling places to outside poll workers. Go play in the heavy traffic. As a practical matter, their power of free speech is denied to them by the 100-foot rule. No longer will we have to have police officers with long tape measures measuring 100 feet. Frankly, I'll tell you a dirty little secret. Many people who have been poll workers, though they're supposed to put the flags at 100 feet, again, good enough for government work, they put it where they think 100 feet is. And they have disparate ways of measuring 100 feet. Some from the door to 100 feet, some from the voting machine to 100 feet. Some, if there's multiple entrances, they pick the nearest thing that looks like 100 feet. Again, this is fraught with difficulty in terms of practical enforcement. In the spirit of moving this forward, because no doubt we will have discussions with the House on this subject as well, I would hope that that amendment, if and when prepared, would be accepted in the spirit that I'm trying to present this bill in, which is we got a lot of work to do, and this is the first step and not the last word.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do not intend tonight, as some have perhaps done, to engage in a blame game over how we got here. Frankly, I don't know. I wasn't privy to any of the negotiations among the folks that brought us this bill, and that's why we have, in rules of courts of law, rules against hearsay. Don't know who said no to whom, don't know who argued for what, don't know who advocated for what, with what degree of strength, don't know who got out-negotiated, who got under-negotiated. No point arguing. I wasn't there. It'd be hearsay evidence. No point casting blame for how we got here, with one exception that I'll get to in a minute. No point rehashing the process by which we got here. Was it the governor's failed VLT plan? Was it the Supreme Court that blew a hole in the budget? As a very wise man used to say to us over in the House, don't tell me how high and stormy the seas are, just help me bring the ship in. No point rehashing all that. Doesn't help us today. I can only explain to you why I cannot support this misnamed, sorry excuse for a budget bill. Now, my number one reason is that it's misnamed, and I can't stand hypocrisy. They call it the Education Funding Protection Act. Ooh. And yet, the 195,000 children that attend chartered non-public schools in this state, at a cost to this state per student of only $840 per year, in comparison to the over $5,000 cost per student in state aid to public school children and charter school children. Those children remain deprived, left out, and excluded. Governor Strickland, through executive order, and those who supported House Bill 1, which didn't include me for this reason mainly, administered an over 15% cut in aid to those children, while the public schools and the charter schools took not much of a cut at all, and depending on how you dance the numbers, they either got a little increase or less than a 1% decrease. So Sister Mary Margaret lost 15%, and the unionized members in the public sector maybe lost 0.25% on a good day. And as Martin Luther King said, conscience is about doing what's right. And we're not doing right by these kids today. Now, when this bill was first surfaced, and they called it the Education Funding Protection Act, I said, whoa, good. They're going to restore the parity principle that we observed in this legislature for 25 years, going back to Dick Celeste, who most of you would agree was no great conservative. All the way from Celeste through Rhodes, through Voinovich and Taft, we had a principle. Whatever percentage increase or decrease was administered to the public school foundation line items, that was the same percentage increase or decrease administered to the two little line items that benefit the chartered non-public schools, the ones that will educate the little Jewish kids in Ohio and the little Catholic kids in Ohio and the little Lutheran kids in Ohio. 25 years of history. So when I say I'm not going to play the blame game, the only exception I'm going to make is on this one. And one of my favorite movies is The Godfather. And you all remember the scene. And there are all the five families around the table. And Vito Corleone says, Tatalia killed my son. I killed his son. Let bygones be bygones. We got to make on, we got to have a truce, and there will be peace. But, if anything should happen to my son Michael, this I do not forgive, and there will not be peace. Well, I say to Governor Strickland, there can be peace. But you have harmed the hairs on the heads of my little children in the Catholic schools and the Jewish schools and the Lutheran schools. And this I do not forgive. And this I will not forgive. And the act is misnamed the Education Funding Protection Act. Amazingly, when I wrote to the public school entitlement crowd who was protesting, oh, Senator, please vote for House Bill 318. We can't afford to lose any money. We need all of our money. I wrote back, I said, well, riddle me this, Batman. How come Sister Mary Margaret down the hall, down the street, just took 15% cut in 1 year alone? I didn't hear you crying about that, Superintendent X, Teacher Y, Union President Z. I heard nary a tear, not a shed, not a line, not a single grimace, not even alligator tears. And you're telling me you can't take any cut at all? And do you know what some of them did? This is gall on top of hypocrisy. They wrote back to me and they said, well, the Catholic schools can just raise tuition. Why, Marie Antoinette would be proud of such an attitude. Because now, to the 400,000 parents of those 195,000 kids, we're saying, number one, we're going to cut your state aid 15%. Number one. Number two, Sister Mary Margaret's going to have to jack your tuition up to make up for that lost aid. Number three, Uncle Billy is going to give his Christmas presents to Uncle Teddy, so you get to pay more taxes next year and the next year. Such a deal cannot be supported for that reason alone. Bill really doesn't do all that much for the public schools either, ladies and gentlemen.
We missed an opportunity. While I'm appreciative of the one-year relief on the all-day kindergarten mandate, which the figures show costs over $200 million in unfunded mandates. That's good, one little thing. We missed the opportunity to allow joint purchasing by education service centers, something that this body and this Senate has included in 2 different bills, only to have taken out by our friends over there in the House. For what reason, I don't know. Stretching the amount of your spend is integral to the better delivery of services, folks. We missed the opportunity to put that provision in this bill. We missed the opportunity to allow every school district to privatize their bus service. Not just the city school districts that have done it successfully for years. That doesn't affect core educational functions. That's given them more flexibility. Why are we taking these options away from local school districts? Now, the second major reason why I'm against this bill has been amply spoken to by my friends, Senator Gilmore, Senator Grindell. I'm sure Senator Faber will speak to it eloquently as well. There are no substantial out-year savings or even a process or plan for the coming debacle, the tsunami. Nothing. 3 demonstration projects. And let me say, while I appreciate 3 demonstration projects, it's kind of like, winning Miss Congeniality in the beauty contest. While I appreciate that, we aren't doing much, folks, for that big coming tsunami about which Representative Dolan spoke so eloquently just a few short months ago, about the wrong bill, of course. We're not doing much. And like the old song by Bachman Turner Overdrive goes, baby, you ain't seen nothing yet. Because $851 million is chump change, nickels and dimes, find it in the couch, compared to $6 billion or $8 billion. And that's the second major problem with this bill. This bill not only does not relieve our reliance on one-time money, it extends our reliance on one-time money, because it's only a 2-year deferral and delay in the receipt of your income tax cut. Well, if that's right, we just dug ourselves another $844 million in the hole. That's not any way to get out of the hole. If you see you're in a hole, stop digging the hole. And we're digging the hole deeper with every single step we're taking by way of extending our reliance on one-time money. Now, I tend to agree with my friend from Geauga County. If you really believe this is only a 2-year deferral of the income tax cut, like George Strait said, I've got some oceanfront property in Arizona. From my front porch, you can see the sea. You're not going to see that 4.2% again, folks. I pretty well guarantee it. But the more fundamental point is, we did have ideas for dealing with the long-term thing, because you know what? Mature people from both sides of the aisle have got to get serious. We can't come waltzing in the day before a budget passes and say, oh, I know, let's cut state government from 24 agencies to 10 tomorrow. You can't do that. But you better start thinking about it right now, because that clock is ticking towards June 2011. And unless we're serious and study it, who knows if it's a good idea or a bad idea? Unless we get serious about performance audits of some of our agencies, that seems to be an idea that's always popular with the minority party. I just don't get it. Well, let's get serious, ladies and gentlemen. I know my friend Senator Strayhorn been pushing for that for years. We floated it this time. All of a sudden, our colleagues on the other side say, I don't think I like that performance audit idea anymore, because it's our people that are doing the performing now. Well, folks, it's time to get serious. It's time to get serious. How about this idea? Why are colleges and universities running student housing? Don't you think we have enough private property managers in the state of Ohio that know how to run apartments and condos and complex situations? And don't you think they could do a better job than the public colleges and universities at running thousands and thousands of dorm rooms? What's wrong with giving the colleges and universities the permissive authority to privatize those places if they want to? If they want to. We proposed that. Went out into the echo chamber, never heard anything back.
How about a commission like the Ohio Society of CPAs recommended to study the privatization of other state assets? You know, the issue around privatizing the turnpike might be the stupidest idea in the world. It might be advanced solely for political purposes at election time. This might be the exact wrong time to do it. I'm willing to concede every one of those points. But until you get a commission together to seriously study whether we could get some money by selling some assets, whether it is the turnpike, whether it is our college dormitory functions, whether it is going into private prisons to a greater extent, we ought to have a commission to start studying it, folks, because the clock is ticking towards June of 11, and that's not in here. How about this? How about a 4-day work week? Might save you some money on energy. A lot of people want LEED certified buildings, and we're green, clean, renewable. One way to cut down on your energy costs is to do a 4-day work week. Why don't we at least look into that? Out into the echo chamber, nothing came back. How about having a study of whether we could have a competition in the BWC? Now, fortunately, Senator Grandel got a resolution out of this body to do that a couple of weeks ago. We're not saying we're going to privatize it. We're saying we're going to look at it. And like my friends over in Congress say, we need a public option to keep the private insurance companies honest. Well, maybe we need a private option to keep the public BWC monopoly honest. How do you know if you don't roll up your sleeves and work? None of that's in here. And finally, Mr. President, the most galling criticism of all that I could level on this bill is that there were other credible ways of filling the $851 million shortfall that aren't in here. Now, I'm going to go through the list that I had, and I'm not here to tell you that everybody was for this list, but I'm here to tell you there's none of this list in here. And I'm here to tell you that these numbers are good, and I'm here to tell you that they add up, if my staff is good at math, to over $1 billion. So I got $150 million extra. In case you don't like my numbers, I'm over by $150 million. Here are just some of the ideas. Administration proposed consolidating 28 boards and commissions in their budget. We took it out. Don't know why. Was going to save $11 million. Common sense sentencing reform. Senators, I know many of the people are here for it. Gee, everywhere I go, I get big accolades. Oh, that's great. That's overdue. Time has come. DRC said it saves $50 million over the biennium. $50 million over the biennium, and more importantly, billions in the out years. Where's that in this bill? Where's that in this bill? What are we doing? What are we doing to get off the dreary, weary treadmill of either raising taxes and having the Republicans throw arrows at you, or cutting services and having you throw arrows at us? Why don't we get off that treadmill, ladies and gentlemen? It doesn't have to be this way. How about decoupling from the federal tax code? Anybody tell me what the 3 provisions of the federal tax code are that Barack Obama and them passed in February? If you can explain them to me, I'll keep it in place. But I'm telling you what, they're arcane. We don't have to do it. We could have decoupled from that. That would have been worth $66 million. We could have delayed income tax indexation. With the exception of about 4 people maybe on our side, nobody knows what that is. We've delayed it for 9 years already. Delay it for another couple, that's $55 million. How about licensing games of skill? When are we going to get real about this? You know, oh, we banned them. Well, that was dumb. We should license them and take some of the money and let the Department of Commerce regulate them and put the good housekeeping seal of approval on the ones that are legitimate so that the sheriff knows to haul out the bunco machines. That's $67 million. Guess what, folks? Those machines are still out there. We're not getting a nickel off them. Who are we kidding? How's about oil and gas drilling on state lands? We can't do that. Well, DNR's numbers said the royalty payments alone would be $10 million. That's what DNR said. This oil and gas people think it's a higher number. How about the casino licensing fees? $200 million. $200 million. We're not touching that in this bill. Now, people say, well, that'll have to be appropriated if it comes in. Yeah, through the controlling board, controlled 4-3 by that side of the aisle. If you think we just through our inaction and inability to deal with that over here, we just gave somebody $200 million of walking around money in an election year. It was money that we could have used. Now, you don't have to believe me. Here's the language of the constitutional amendment. Been carrying it around for months. The upfront license fee shall be used to fund state economic development programs which support regional job training efforts to equip Ohio's workforce with additional skills to grow the economy. That's what it says. That's what it says. And that money will be in here within 6 months of passage, because we got to pass the legislation to create the Casino Control Commission. And when we do, we can say, pay up or lose your right to have your casino. And I assure you they will pay up, because it's a sweet deal for them. Now, I asked Chancellor Fingerhut, one of the honorable, honest people in this whole place, and I read him that exact language. I said, Chancellor, is this what the University System of Ohio does? Do you meet that description? Absolutely. He didn't equivocate. He didn't tap dance. He said, absolutely. There's $200 million that we could have given to Chancellor Fingerhut, moved the money around, shortened the education shortfall. Heck, we got $51 million we're spending on K-12 career technical education. Could have used it for that. We're not doing it. I'll raise taxes as a last resort, but not as a first resort, and not when it's not necessary. Now, we got a lot of flack for saying, let's take $10 million out of the Housing Trust Fund. Oh. Well, here's the little dirty secret on that, ladies and gentlemen. At the time we proposed it, there was that much unencumbered money in the Housing Trust Fund. And within a few days after we proposed it, what happened? They ran right to the controlling board and encumbered $13.9 million of it. Well, that wasn't our fault, but it was there, but now it's gone. How about getting rid of the percent of art requirement? How many people knew we even have that? I know Senator Faber does, Senator Rendell does. We require all major construction projects at colleges and universities in this state to have a percent set aside for artwork. Now, I like artwork. But maybe they'd like to use that 1% to build a lab. Maybe they'd like to use that 1% to build a classroom. Maybe they'd like to use that 1% to build a research facility. Maybe they could live without the statues of naked ladies for a few years while we're in the worst economy since the Great Depression. Maybe. Why not give them a try? How about this? Do you know, amidst the greatest crisis in the world since the Great Depression, which it is, I've said that to you a year ago, all right, it is, we still are giving money to the Department of Public Safety to run seatbelt education campaigns? Click it or ticket. Ooh. Paying overtime to the Highway Patrol. We're still doing that. Why are we doing that? If K-12 education is the rock-solid foundation of our future, if nothing is more important than our little children, all of them, I might add, if that's the case, and I believe it is, then what are we doing blowing money on that nonsense in the middle of the greatest depression since Herbert Hoover? And finally, folks, VLTs remain a viable option, with or without their signatures. Nothing stops the governor from issuing a new executive order with a lower upfront license fee and a lower tax rate, and starting that tomorrow. And let OhioVote.org, whether they succeed or don't succeed in getting the names on a petition, and my money still says they're not going to at the end of the day, we can still do that. 7 tracks times $40 million, $280 million, 33% tax rate, not 50% tax rate, start January 1 of 11, $280 million. Add it all up and there's $1 billion. Maybe I'm off by $150 million. We still got more than $850 million. But nobody wanted to do that hard work. We want something simple, like a tax increase. Well, I'll do a lot of things, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll even do a tax increase if I got to. but I have yet to be convinced that it's necessary at this degree of magnitude. We're not solving the out-year problem. We're driving that truck right off the cliff. You ain't seen nothing yet come June of 11. We're selling the Catholic school children down the river. We're giving them a false promise in this bill that if we have unheralded surpluses in our general fund, Sister Mary Margaret gets the crumbs. Don't be kidding that you're doing anything for the Catholic school children with the provisions of this bill. That's, as Monty Python said, a mockery of a sham of a mockery of a sham. So for those reasons, I will be voting no. We insisted last week when we moved on this resolution to include an additional $100 million for this program, which is universally supported by the counties throughout this state, the cities throughout this state, the townships throughout this state, the contractors and the engineers throughout this state, because they understand the importance of a good, solid infrastructure, no matter what kind of job workers are going to travel on that infrastructure. Whether they're the smart nanotechnology PhDs working at University of Cincinnati or Ohio State, or whether it's Joe Lunchbucket making that weary trudge back and forth to the factory. It was something for every Ohioan. The actual amendment, in my Boehner-esque moment here, that is the amendment that was put in committee yesterday. The whole point of it is we're going to provide training for local law enforcement. So we don't have some latter-day Barney Fife running around apprehending people solely on suspicion of looking Hispanic, Gabonese, Senegalese, Somali, or anything else. That is not proper. So we're going to give them training to know what to look for so they don't embarrass themselves or commit civil rights violations or commit other violations of due process. Moreover, any hope for comprehensive congressional action on this subject is a pipe dream. I mean, let's just be practical here, folks. President Bush made a major undertaking to try to get this done. There was something called the McCain-Kennedy bill, which was a bipartisan bill to try to get something comprehensive done. Pathway to citizenship, all arrest, border fence in Arizona, all arrest, and what happened? Woo, into the ground at 500 miles an hour. It never happened. Boom. Now, do you think that a Congress exhausted, embittered, angry, and ready to go home and campaign after the health care debate is going to do anything on this issue for the rest of this year? I don't think so, Lucy. I really don't. So it isn't going to happen, folks, not this year. And is that an excuse for inaction on our part? I don't think so. Now, all we're doing is reinstating, word for word and jot for jot, the language that was law from 2005 to 2009 that was shepherded into law by Senator Bob Gardner. And therefore, apropos of my many speeches, which I will not regale you with again today, I am suggesting that we start putting in place some mechanisms that will help our local governments deal with the oncoming deluge, of which this bill is a small, modest, but nonetheless useful step forward. For those of you who believe the answer is blowing in the wind, as Bob Dylan once said, I think we all need to be disabused of that silly notion in Ohio. The fact of the matter is, I agree with my good colleague, seatmate here, that man-made global warming is a bunch of globaloney. I agree that every green job we create, as we had in the debate over cap and tax, will end up costing us other real jobs. I believe that. I know that Ohio is ranked no better than 36th in the country in its capacity for wind generation, no better than 36th. Yes, we're 5th in the supply chain. We have a lot of companies that make parts, but in terms of the ability of the Ohio landscape to generate wind power, which is unreliable and intermittent, even under optimal conditions, we rank very low in the nation. We have a densely populated state. We're not Montana. We're not Texas. We're not Oklahoma. We're not Tornado Alley. And so, you know, I don't think you can compare conditions here to conditions there. And the evils of this new form of electric generation are going to be visited on largely rural and suburban communities that happen to be located near Farmer Joe's back 40 that he doesn't need to raise soybeans anymore, so he's going to lease it to a foreign-owned wind company and make some dough with wind turbines. I get all that. I really do. And I will also point out, and this is stuck in my craw for about 2.5 years now, when I developed the standards under which wind power is sited in this state, and we had everybody in the room, the governor's people, the wind opponents, the townships, the school boards, the whole kabang, they were all in the room. And I said, while we're here writing these standards for how we're going to go about siting wind farms in Ohio, does anybody want to talk about revisiting the tax treatment of wind farms? And they all said, oh no. You pass Senate Bill 221 with this renewable power mandate, and we will be beating a track to your door to build wind farms. I said, okay, I made the offer. You don't want it touched? We won't touch it. Now here we are, about 2 years later, and they want to come in and say, oh, by the way, in addition to our federal tax subsidy, we want to be exempt from the tangible personal property tax. Now, with all that said, you might say, well, why in the devil is Seitz going to vote yes on this? I just wanted to be very clear that it's not because I'm a supporter of wind power. It is rather because we fixed some very important problems with the bill as introduced. The local people get to say, if they buy the green jobs argument, if they think the answer is blowing in the wind, no doubt they'll say, okay, we'll give you a big tax exemption and further subsidize your industry. But if they're old Dutchmen like me and they say, you know what, at the end of the day we'll be burning coal, they might say, sorry, no soup for you. Take your wind and build it in Iowa. And as you all remember, because we stood up for this in the Senate when our friends in the House weren't too wild about it, and that was, if this newfangled stuff costs Bob and Betty Buckeye a lot more money than the old-fangled, dirty old coal and natural gas, by golly, you can take your renewable benchmarks and shove them in the Ohio River, because we're not doing it anymore. I love the fact we're including advanced coal, nuclear. Good luck getting one of those built in 5 years, Senator Gibbs, but at least we're trying, and I like that. So maybe some of this stuff will work. Solar, don't see a lot of sun out there today, but maybe that'll work too. Maybe we'll become Arizona one of these fine days. I might say that the proponents of the bill spent about a year resisting my suggestion that we weren't going to pass this with a willful and wanton standard. Even though that's what Texas did and some other states did, they passed it willful and wanton for the emergency room. And I said, nah, baby, nah, that's too generous. You're being a pig. So please work with me here, and we'll try to come up with something between the usual malpractice standard and the willful and wanton standard that you want. And finally, after a great deal of hand-wringing, we came up with the bill that's before us today. And therefore, under the law, since they have those petitions pending, and since they seem to have got enough names on the petition to allow a vote, the operation of the statute is suspended. So the Lottery Commission cannot make rules with respect to statutes that are in suspense by reason of the shadowy campaign funded by, we're still trying to find out who, some outfit out of Virginia. If you believe that, I got some oceanfront property in Arizona to sell you. Secretary Brunner's trying to find out who these people are. I sure want to know. But because of that, the Lottery Commission cannot make any rules to implement Governor Strickland's plan to put video lottery terminals at the racetracks, a plan that has already received the backing of 17 members of this chamber. So to that extent, my colleagues that are content to see the horse racing industry be consigned to hell are probably not willing to support this, because we're not just giving them authority to make rules on something that other people voted for. They're going to say, well, now if I vote for this, I'm actually voting for the racetracks, and I cannot bear to help the equine industry. So there's problem number one. Problem number two is the amendment, which I think has great merit, was not presented during our committee hearings. I know and have great respect for the chairman. As I said this morning, when I refrained from offering my skill game amendment, which I also hope gets in conference committee or soon thereafter, out of respect for the boss, and so there's no lack of clarity in this context. The boss means Chairman Husted, and not necessarily the entire administration. But to avoid embarrassing the boss, I am not willing to support this on the floor today because of those problems. Having said that, I think as long as we're going down this road, the people of Ohio have spoken. They voted overwhelmingly for casinos. Full table games, any game authorized in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Michigan, they're in, they're all in, to use the Texas Hold'em analogy. They're all in. Don't you think that if the people voted overwhelmingly for full-scale casinos, they're also willing to authorize VLTs at the racetrack? It just defies logic to me that the people would say, let's bring in these out-of-towners to build casinos with their out-of-town money, and let's let the racetracks go by the boards. I don't think the people meant that. They have crossed the Rubicon. It is time to bring the governor's plan to fruition sooner rather than later. I hope we find out who these shadowy characters are that are trying to frustrate the governor's plan. And when we do, I hope they will get the full opprobrium that they deserve from a public outraged about their attempt to hide from the voters who they really are. But until that day happens, and they decide to abandon their quest to bamboozle Ohio voters, we'll try to keep this a simple casino bill today and work on bringing relief to the racetracks as soon as humanly possible. They need it every bit as much as those 4 inner cities that are going to benefit from these 4 casinos. Thank you. But those kinds of nice, solid institutions like the Bailey Building and Loan and It's a Wonderful Life are few and far between these days. But most of us realize that if you've ever been to a loan closing on your house, you're not going to sit there and read that pile of paperwork. You're just going to say, give me my money so I can get this house, and you're not going to read the disclosures. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I rise in support of the bill, but mostly to thank all of the wonderful orators today for making me feel 10 years younger. You see, 10 years ago when I was a freshman legislator, Chairman Wilimowski created a special subcommittee of his committee and put me in charge of it to work on the first concealed carry bill. So all the debate I heard this afternoon made me feel 10 years younger because we heard it all 10 years ago. And we heard from Bob Taft, who was so nervous about doing anything in this area. And at that time, I plead guilty. I said, well, we got to do concealed carry, but I don't think we want to let guns in bars because even in the old Wild West, they said, check your 6-shooter at the door. And I said, I'm worried that even if the concealed carry permit holder is a great citizen, that maybe he'll take his jacket off and have his gun in there, and some old drunk from the back of the bar will stagger up and grab the gun and commit mayhem. So the original concealed carry bill, 10 years ago when I was young, did not allow concealed carry in the bars. And for similar reasons, we made it harder than heck to carry a gun in the car. And it was the same cast of characters who warned us that if we did concealed carry 10 years ago, all the world would come to an end. The chiefs of police and the FOP and the usual cast of characters. Oh, you can't do this, even though 40-some other states had already allowed some form of concealed carry then. So I wrote the law the way it read originally. And the reason we call it the revised code, folks, is because you live with experience. You say, gee, all these bad things did not happen. A couple years later, it was law enforcement that came to us and said, you know what? We'd like a little loosening on this guns in bars business because we want, as Senator Faber pointed out, we want our off-duty cops and our undercover detectives to be able to have a gun in the bar. Oh, okay. Then a couple years later, all right, they came to us and they said, you know, we don't like this victim zone that you've created with no carry in the bar. So we said, okay, we're going to let the proprietor of the bar,
or the owner of the establishment, we'll let him carry concealed. And that way it won't be a victim zone anymore because, you know, good old Sam the bartender can have a gun to make sure everybody's safe against those lawless criminals coming here trying to shoot the place up. So we did that. So here today we are with the next step on this evolutionary road in both of these 10-year-old debates about the extent to which concealed carry should be allowed in liquor permit premises and about the extent to which you can carry your gun in the car. And I would just like to say, we've moved along. The world never came to an end. Let freedom ring. We're proceeding cautiously. We're doing our job, proceeding cautiously, proceeding deliberately. I do not predict Armageddon should we pass this bill, and I opt for freedom. I urge passage. Thank you, Mr. President. I don't mean to unduly prolong the debate. I certainly supported in committee the state salamander and the state amphibian and the state frog and anything of that nature for all the reasons so eloquently spoken by my colleagues. Proud to support that. I think the reason an attempt was made to remove those provisions from the bill was that we were not certain whether our friends in the House were going to be comfortable with using their bill for this purpose. And I say this because this is serious business, not to say the state salamander and the state frog aren't serious business, but let me just remind you of what's really in this bill and why it has an emergency clause. There's a hospital in Brown County that's going to go broke if this bill doesn't pass today. There are two important commissions that we set up. The State and Local Government Commission to get those locals to start cooperating with one another and come up with some recommendations, and their life expires July 1. So we will not have the benefit of any report from them unless this bill passes today. The State Commission on the Preservation of History, which was set up by us to look at the whole issue on preserving state history and how better to fund the Ohio Historical Society. Senator Hughes, Senator Turner, you're on that commission with me, and you know we've been meeting, and you know we've been working hard. But our life expires July 1. And you know we're not quite there, and I figured nobody's going to read our report on July 1 anyway, so we extend that to September 1. But if we don't pass this bill today, that goes away. There are other provisions in this bill that Senator Hughes mentioned, and the main purpose of the bill is to give townships a little greater flexibility in dealing with nuisances. And as a former township trustee, I'm telling you that's important to do today, because in the summertime is when you have all these nuisance properties, when the grass grows mile high as an elephant eye, and the townships are trying to get these properties remediated. So if you don't pass this bill today, you're condemning the townships to another summer of nuisance properties dealt with in a cumbersome manner. So I am happy to support frogs, salamanders, ladybugs, spiders, snakes, birds, you know, animals, leopards, lions, you name it.
Senator Seitz, none of those are on for consideration.
You could amend it to include all those things and make all the school children happy, and that's good. But I want to remind you, therefore, that if you want this to happen, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle should probably, when we recess, pick up the phone and call your friends over in the House where you are in the majority and say, hey, listen, we finally won this 10-year fight. Please do not gum up this very important bill on very important subjects by styling and profiling over whether we're going to have a salamander or a frog. Thank you. But folks, we're facing a storm. I hate to be Cassandra. We're facing a storm in 12 short months. And I've said for a long time, if we don't start thinking of some new things to do now, we're going to be sitting here a year from now, and we'll relish the days when all we had to talk about was bullfrogs and salamanders, because if we don't do something now, we're going to be talking about massive budget cuts or massive tax increases, and that won't be any more pleasant for us than you, in no matter which denominations we control the chamber or you do. So it's time to sort of suck it up, and let's explore some of these new options and get them on the books now so that we can at least begin to throw lifelines to all the institutions that are going to be capsizing next year if we do nothing. We do share one thing in common, the first point of commonality. He was the chief sponsor of the legislation creating the Ohio African American Hall of Fame. And Senator Miller, I'm sure you recollect that that legislation ultimately was passed on the last day of session a few years ago and tacked into a bill of mine that dealt with environmental covenants, a bill that dealt with the environment. And I was informed that the only way the Senate would pass my bill is if I agreed to let Senator Miller's legislation become a part of my bill. And of course, rather than being stubborn and ridiculous, it seems to be the want all too frequently in the last 2 years, I was very, very happy to agree to the inclusion of that important legislation in my also very important legislation on only one condition, Senator Miller, and that is that when the facility opened, I would be granted a seat next to Halle Berry. a promise that remains unredeemed. So I'm sure you'll work on that. But I would simply offer this. If the bill before us today is a house of wood, then the current Department of Development is a house on fire. The lesson being, this Department of Development is not moving at the speed of business. They're not even moving at an 18th century courier post speed. And a major corporation in my county that runs countless number of convenience stores that had an environmentally sound idea, they wanted to get with a green program, and they held up their whole process for, let's see, April through December, hoping to get a piece of this $5 or $8 million of free federal money. Now, if the Department of Development can't even figure out in 8 months how to give away free federal money, maybe it's time to let that process be done by a house of wood, because the house that's doing the business now is on fire, and it's time to do something different. I urge support for the bill. Now, folks, you all remember the old line, you can't fight City Hall? Under this bill, public employees can't talk to City Hall. It's an unfair labor practice if they exercise their First Amendment rights to call up their councilman, to have their wife call up the councilman, to have their kid call off the councilman and say, hey, look, Councilman Simperman or whoever, I need to talk to you about a matter affecting my life. I don't know about you, but that's not what I learned in First Amendment law school when I went to law school. When we started on this road, it was because the governor and others rightly argued that having unelected arbitrators make decisions that would bind the taxpayer is unfair and needs to be stopped. And as I said previously, I completely agree with the governor in that regard. But the bill that comes to us today from the House, ironically, comes full circle. Because in the case of colleges, state colleges, we are saying that the College Board of Trustees gets to make the final decision. No one elects them. In the case of state hospitals, we are saying that the Hospital Board of Trustees makes the final decision. No one elects them. In the case of the state itself, we are saying that the Controlling Board makes the decision. No one elects the Controlling Board. The Controlling Board is selected by the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House, and includes among its membership at least one individual who is elected by no one. So because I am more faithful to our governor than my colleagues, I say the product is flawed. We now have binding decisions being made by unelected individuals, the very thing that Governor John Kasich said he wanted to stop. And that is the product that came to us from the Ohio House of Representatives. Now, there is one significant difference between the current state of the law and what comes to us tonight. In the current state of the law, we have a binding arbitration process in which an independent third party who has no vested interest in the outcome is making the final decision. We have substituted that process for an unelected third party who is biased and has a vested interest in the outcome making the decision.
That, my friends, is not progress. That, my friends, is not progress. That is not consistent with what Governor Kasich said he wanted. Some people say, well, I don't care about college basketball because I'm a football fan. But as you recall, when the football game goes to overtime, the referee brings out a coin, and they flip the coin. And the coin says either heads or tails. How would our beloved Cincinnati Bengals or Cleveland Browns feel if at the start of sudden death overtime, the referee brought out that coin, and it was a two-headed coin, in which we would flip the coin 1,000,000 times, but it would always come up for the other team. And those Pittsburgh Steelers would get that first possession in overtime every time. That, my friends, is the dispute resolution process that has arrived at us tonight from the Ohio House. So we have now come up with a solution in which our friends in public sector labor have 3 ways to lose. If the local legislative body does nothing, management wins. If the local legislative body chooses management's offer over the union's offer, management wins. And if by some chance they should actually choose the union's offer, being the more expensive of the 2 offers, and if their chief fiscal officer certifies that we don't have enough money to pay it, the voters get a 3rd chance to say, management wins. This is the equivalent of 3 cherries and 3 lemons in the casinos. This is a fundamentally rigged process. I am no particular fan of public sector unions. You all who are in the room waving your lovely hands have not been big supporters of mine in the past. I have said for 11 years that we need reform in collective bargaining. I say before and I say now there are reforms that are achievable, attainable, and would help us give local governments the flexibility they need to manage through tough times. But I do have in my soul a firm commitment to the idea of justice, in which the idea is that no man can be a judge and an advocate in his own cause. That is precisely the situation that we're setting up in this bill, and for that reason, though I credit the House with several salutary improvements, they failed to fix the fundamental flaw. I will be voting no. The idea that the big city and the county have a veto power over the alternative, over the local government fund distribution is a little obnoxious. Are we going to have regionalism, or are we going to continue plantation mentalities in which the largest city gets to control what goes on to the detriment of all the suburban governments and townships in the county? With the exception of only one place in Ohio, Columbus, the big cities in each county are now smaller relative to their total county population than they were the last time this formula was updated. Toledo has shrunk, Cincinnati has shrunk, Cleveland has shrunk, Youngstown has shrunk, Akron has shrunk, Canton has shrunk, and the suburbs have grown. So these people are sole proprietors. These people are businessmen and women. These people are not employees working for the man who deserve the protection of collective bargaining. These are individuals. We would not let General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler collude and collaborate and form a cartel against the interests of the public, and we do not do it any more so because individual sole proprietors choose to form a union, which in this case is not a union at all. It is a cartel. It is a cartel. I am an antitrust lawyer. We don't like monopolies. We don't like cartels. We want to break up cartels. It would be different if these people were employed by someone. In that case, the National Labor Relations Act already gives them the right to form a union and have collective bargaining. But what this amendment would do is to continue an ill-advised policy of the previous administration, which authorized the formation of a cartel of sole proprietors, businessmen and businesswomen. That's not collective bargaining. I urge defeat of the amendment. And I would also say, somewhat in jest, when you carry a bill like this, you end up with an unfortunate byproduct, and that is that suddenly you begin to get fan mail from every prison in the state. And, maybe we can amend the bill if the prisoners can't have their sexual predator victims' photos in the cell, maybe they can lose Senator Seitz's addresses also, because we've gotten every prisoner in the state, it seems, thinking, hey, can you do something in this bill for me? But you know what? I believe in the commandment of that highest Republican in our pantheon, Ronald Reagan, who said, I don't care who gets the credit as long as the job gets done. So we are here to celebrate a bipartisan success. And it was a fascinating movie. But I couldn't help, as I watched that movie, think that if that had happened today, it never would have been completed. Because along about the time they were building it, guess what? They built one stretch too close to the mountain, and the whole mountain slid down, and it wiped out the train, and it wiped out the village where the train was pulling into. And scores, if not hundreds of people died. And they also built a few of those turns a little bit too tight, and lo and behold, they lost a bunch of trains that fell off the trestle, and a whole lot of people died. And, of course, that's not to count all the people that died in the backbreaking, excruciating work of blasting through that rock and building that transcontinental railroad. But you know what? They persevered, and they finally finished the job. The railroads corrected their errors, and they made those turns slower and more gradual and more arcing to improve safety because they wanted to do the right thing, even at the cost of great human life. And as a result, we had that Canadian Transcontinental Railroad. And some of the finest resorts in the world popped up along that route. The Banff Springs, the Chateau Lake Louise, Jasper Park Lodge, been to all three of them. I highly recommend them. Life is not without risk. If you want cheap gas, if you want supplies of oil, if you want jobs, if you want progress, you can't sit there with your head in the sands, tar sands or otherwise, while we continue our dependency on foreign oil from robber barons in the Middle East who have not got our best interests at heart and who are, even as we speak, threatening to close the Straits of Hormuz, through which some 60% of the world's oil supply currently travels. So therefore, I support the resolution, but if we don't get this right in this bill, we got 6 more penalty enhancement bills floating around here, stacked up like airplanes at O'Hare Airport on a Friday afternoon, and it's important to get it right this time, because whatever we do here becomes the template for the next 6, 10, 15, or however many there are bills that increase penalties based on someone's victim status. Anyone other than me can take a photograph with a cell phone, so I'm told. All right? Thank you, Mr. President. Apologies for being late. You know, about 8 or 9 years ago, a young fellow showed up in the State House, and he had a nice Southern drawl, put me immediately in mind of the great Larry Householder and the great Doug White. Their soft Southern charms have always enthralled me. And I said, when I met this fella, I like this guy. Shortly thereafter, standing outside, having a cigarette, this nice young man joined me out there, having a cigarette. I said, I like this guy. Shortly thereafter, we arranged to meet for dinner, a couple more, and we had a lovely dinner. I think it was over at G. Michael's. I believe it was the first time. And he orders a Jack and Coke. I said, I like this guy. And then during the dinner, his cell phone rang. And the ringtone was a song by Aerosmith. I said, I like this guy. Dave Daniels is the person of whom I speak. Now, many of you don't know that he hails from Greenfield. And there's another famous person from Greenfield, the great country singer Johnny Paycheck. I happen to know that. Now, interestingly, David didn't think too much of Johnny Paycheck. I guess that's the Aerosmith ringtone. And so Dave may not be as famous as Johnny Paycheck,
but he certainly spent less time in jail than Johnny Paycheck did. But he did pick up one line from Johnny Paycheck's most famous song. And he looked around at this body, and with Johnny Paycheck, he said, "Take this job and shove it. I ain't working here no more." But he's gone on to greater things. We will miss him grievously. It is a tragedy that you are leaving the Senate. But it is the gain for the state of Ohio, Governor Kasich, to have that sound, sensible, even-handed, brilliant, unassuming, self-effacing gentleman that David T. Daniels is. And I, my friend, will miss you sorely, as will we all. But we wish you all the best. And so you will go on to greater fame than Johnny Paycheck and stay out of jail less than he did. Thank you. We should keep our focus on one thing. What will produce the lowest energy costs for the people in our Senate districts? I don't know about you, but I don't like paying $4 a gallon for gasoline, and it's going up. I don't know about you, but I don't like paying higher energy bills to Duke Energy and First Energy and Dayton Power and Light and so forth. So it's not about subsidizing wind or solar. We can have our little windmills and all the Dutch girls can dance around in the tulips. That's all great. And we can have the solar power, and that works great when the sun shines. That's fine. And we can have hydropower, and we can have waste gas, and as Senator Coley says, sheep poop and cow poop and so forth. All that's great. The question is one thing. What is going to produce the lowest energy rates over time for people in this great state of Ohio? And whatever that is, that's what I'm for. If it's coal, I'm for it. If it's natural gas, I'm for it. If it's oil, I'm for it. If it turns out to be the little Dutch girls in the windmills, I'm for that too. But the evidence is that's not where it is right now. So this bill is a step in the right direction, and I salute my good friend from Butler County for introducing it. Unlike my younger friend from Hamilton County, I am old enough to remember the TV show. It was Father Knows Best, not Mother Knows Best. But I'm also old enough to remember a song from the 80s, but I can't remember the group. And the title of the song was Things That Make You Go, Things That Make You Go, Then I remember we had a little flapdoodle over Senate Bill 5 last year. I remember that very distinctly. And I remember that there was an idea brought up late August, early September, which frankly I was for. Why don't we stop all this expensive kerfluffle and just repeal Senate Bill 5 and go back and, as my learned friend from Butler County said, hit the reset button? I thought that was a good idea, but what I think makes no difference. You see, I'm all about suppressing the vote. So let's talk about what our friends who don't believe in suppressing the vote said about that. Senate Minority Leader Capri Cafaro, quote, Senate Democrats continue to support the repeal of Senate Bill 5 either through legislation or at the ballot box. House Minority Leader Armand Budish, if Governor Kasich and Republican legislative leaders are serious about compromising on Senate Bill 5, they will take the necessary first step and reconvene the legislature to completely repeal this bill. Upon the complete legislative repeal of Senate Bill 5, we can then begin to do what should have been done 8 months ago and have an open and honest discussion with those affected by these proposed law changes. End quote. State Representative Tracy Hurd. If the GOP was serious about working together at this late stage, they will convene the legislature next week, repeal Senate Bill 5, and start the process with a clean slate and everyone at the table. Anything else is simply media theatrics. Weren't they proposing to repeal a bill that was subject to the referendum, thereby suppressing the will of the voters? And there were about 900,000 of them that wanted to vote on Senate Bill 5. And when Secretary Husted kind of stole Senator Robhoff and my thunder by making this proposal, even though it was our idea, but that's all right. Well, I'm used to that around here. That's why what we're doing today is legal, constitutional, and right. We made a deal.
We're going to make sure the House version of this bill and the Senate version of this bill read the same from soup to nuts. And we kept that deal. Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I want to echo and just say ditto to everything my friend Senator Smith said. She's very eloquent today, and rightfully so. It is my honor today to salute our departing Senate President, Tom Niehaus. I'm very honored to have been asked to participate in these heartfelt ceremonies, although frankly, I found out I was the fourth choice. Gene Schmidt, Michelle Schneider, and Karen Gilmore all said they couldn't do it. But seeing as how we're 2 days away, I think, from the end of session, and there's no more committees to throw me off of and no chairmanships to take away, I figured I could say exactly what I think. Not that I don't usually. And ironically enough, they purchased the policy from American Family Insurance. And they found out that American Family Insurance doesn't cover the family. Finally, this legislation embraces the principle of uniformity through what I have affectionately for many, many years called the Stop in the Name of Love provision. I would simply observe that while we are creating a new state artifact today, our friends in the House have actually done something that would truly promote Ohio history by adding to the Ohio Historical Society's budget $1.25 million in each of the next 2 years. And as the old saying goes, talk's cheap, it takes money to buy whiskey. So I hope all the great commendations that are given about the Adena pipe and all of our wonderful historical markers in Ohio, that's well felt, and I agree with every bit of it. But let's remember that we also need to expend funds in order to preserve and promote Ohio's history. Thank you. I would count no double bubble vote other than one that is identical. And the reason I believe that to be the correct course, in contrast to the more liberal approach being taken by my distinguished friend Senator Rob Hoff, is because any other standard than identicality puts you on the road to Broward County 2000, where the people were divining the intent of the voter by determining how far the Chad had been pushed in. It is precisely to avoid the subjective determination of voter intent that clear rules are necessary. Thank you, Mr. President. It has become my fate, I suppose, over the years to give a proper eulogy to industries we are about to put out of business for no very good reason. And today, it is my privilege to give the eulogy for the 6,000 to 8,000 people that will be put out of work by adoption of this measure. There is no doubt that internet cafes have proliferated, that many of them are shoddy operations, that many of them are operating in an illegal fashion, and no doubt that the 8th District Court of Appeals has ruled that, at least as applied to the sale of internet time, the internet cafe business is illegal under current law. There's no doubt about any of that. There is also no doubt on the part of anyone in the industry that they would prefer a system that incentivizes good behavior by proper licensure, regulation, background checks, and taxation. And the single biggest flaw in this bill is that it takes the approach, shoot 'em all and let God sort it out. However, it is what it is. I just rise, sort of like Jeremiah, to warn you that we have been down this road before. It did not work. I predict it will not work again. And I urge my colleagues to consider the lives and fortunes of those 6,000 to 8,000 people before we drop the guillotine on them today. Thank you. I'm reminded as I begin my remarks here that some of the folks that do not want us to concur are basically saying, gee, something's fishy, and they suspect foul play. I prefer to take that analogy in a different direction. It is a fairly easy thing to design a fish.
It has scales, fins, gills, a couple variations. Maybe it has teeth, maybe it doesn't, maybe it's largemouth, maybe it's smallmouth, maybe the coloration on the fish is different, but it's a pretty straightforward proposition. And it's a pretty straightforward proposition to design a fowl. The bird has 2 legs, it's got claws, it's got wings, it's got feathers, it's got a beak. Yeah, there are variations, the size of the beak, the coloration of the feathers. Pretty straightforward proposition. What we have, and I've always had here with Jobs Ohio, is something that is not entirely a fish and not entirely a fowl. And that presents definitional problems that we are being asked today to clarify. And this has been a long and tendentious argument among reasonable, intelligent people that urge us, frankly, at the end of the day, to clarify where the public right to audit stops and private enterprise begins. You know, if we were to give a little quiz to college students or high school students about what is the state biennial budget bill all about, they would probably say, well, it's the mechanism by which we allocate state general revenue fund spending for a 2-year period. And that's certainly correct. I'd give them about a C+ for that answer. Because the reality is that this budget is so much more than that. This budget is so much more than that because there are 33 of us, 99 people in the other chamber, the executive branch and all their myriad agencies, all of whom use the budget as an opportunity to find ways to streamline government, solve problems, and make things run a little bit more efficiently. And many of the things in this 5,000-page document are small things. But the old saying, little strokes fell great oaks, is true. Just this week, I happened to run across an article in the Dayton Daily News about the school bus privatization amendments that we put in the budget 2 years ago. And I read with pride, it was my amendment, that the school district in question had just privatized their yellow bus service and announced that they were going to be saving $770,000 over the period of the new contract that they had signed. Now, in a budget of $63 billion or $61 billion, whatever it is, $770,000 is not all that much money. But there are countless examples of that kind of thing strewn throughout all 5,000 pages of this budget. Remarkably, we have now gone on for 7 hours. Now I know why Speaker Householder always started the budget debate at midnight. He figured people would shut up quicker than if they started in the morning and went all day. Brilliant man, Speaker Householder. But be that as it may, we've gone on 7 hours, and the things I'm going to talk about haven't even been mentioned by anybody yet. My major theme, which is that in addition to all the other reasons why this is a good budget, there's lots of examples of progress, singles, bunt singles, sometimes doubles that are making progress. For example, I have an acquaintance in Cincinnati. He's been a real estate appraiser for 30 years. He decided he wanted to get a real estate broker's license. Lo and behold, Ohio revised code says in order to get a real estate broker's license, you have to take a course in appraising. He taught the course in appraising. But because of the way a prior General Assembly wrote the law, the Commerce Department said, Senator, you're going to have to change the law. Well, we're doing that in this budget, proving that ordinary constituents can have their voices heard. I mean, the fact of the matter is that's a very common sense solution. Reminded of Ethel Merman and Annie Get Your Gun. You don't have to wear a professor's dome not to go for the honey when the bee's at home. It's just common sense that we fix that. We got a cemetery down our way, 12-acre cemetery. There's a tax lien on it because it's abandoned, and there was a lender lien on it. Current Ohio law says you can't foreclose on a cemetery, so the liens just sat there. They couldn't be foreclosed on. Body parts and bones are bubbling up out of the ground. And the township that I formerly represented, that Leader Kearney now represents, said, you know what, can you give us relief from these liens so we can take the cemetery over and put the bones back in the ground? We did that in this budget. We did that in this budget. Little things, little strokes fell great oaks. I would say that's because my Catholics are smarter than the average bear and figured out what a great deal this was for them the minute we passed it 2 years ago. So, but it's coming soon to a neighborhood near you, and we've got a solution for that in this budget. Senator Rob Hoff, you've been my dear friend and advocate during the leadership meetings for most of my amendments, and you can prove you can improve too. But you did a pretty good job. The day has been long, but I asked the question this evening, to die by fire, to die by ice. What difference does it make? One short month ago, we sentenced the internet cafes in Ohio to death by ice, and we passed a bill that everyone admitted would put them out of business. The folks that like internet cafes decided that they would take that matter to a popular referendum, and if they are able to get the requisite signatures by round about the 1st of September, the people will have their right to exercise their decision on whether the bill should stand or not, just as they did on Senate Bill 5, just as they did on House Bill 194 before we repealed it and replaced it, thereby frustrating that referendum. The people would have a right to referendum on the question, should internet cafes die by ice? The amendment before us this evening instead sentences the internet cafes to death by fire. And because the amendment before us tonight contains an emergency clause, which is immediately effective, which means these folks will be felons on day one without any advance notice, right? They will be dead by fire. And because the emergency clause is a part of this amendment, there will be no right to referendum on the sentence of death by fire. To be sure, the internet cafes will still have the right to a referendum on death by ice. That referendum will assuredly be quite moot, because having died by fire, what difference does it make if we also die by ice? As my good friend Representative Rutherford, who's an undertaker, observed to me today, at what point do we stop simply killing an industry, and at what point does this become gross abuse of a corpse? A very good question posed by my dear friend the undertaker, and one appropriate to the circumstances. It seems to me, being a practical person, that we could have simply waited to do this until September, because if our friends who want a referendum on death by ice fail to get the signatures by September 1st, then they will have killed themselves. And I always believe in giving people enough rope with which to hang themselves so I do not have to be the butcher myself. We can certainly enact this provision in September if they get enough signatures and you still feel strongly enough that we need to double sentence them to death, both death by fire and death by ice. We can act in September without doing violence to the concept of referendum, particularly if they fail to get the number of signatures required between now and September, which is certainly a possibility because, by your own admission, the Stop in the Name of Love bill that I proudly co-sponsored earlier this year, will make it tougher for them to get their signatures. That might have been an idea. It is a budget that gives tax cuts to 98.5% of the taxpayers in Ohio. So if you are disappointed, outraged, angry, frustrated over the tax cuts, well, you're speaking for 1.5% of the Ohio population. I will take the 98.5%. I'm not a particularly poll-driven person, as you know, but 98.5%, I think I'm going to go with them. 98.5% that collectively will share in $2.7 billion. Not to recreate the Austin Powers movie, but $2.7 billion. That's real money. Now, my friends argue that, well, that might be true, but the people at the lower end of the income scale are not getting as big a tax cuts as the people at the upper end of the income scale. And of course, this is one of the reasons why I support the implementation of the Common Core math standards in Ohio and across the 50 states. Because you know what? The higher income taxpayers are paying more tax today. So as a matter of Common Core math standards, when you cut tax rates, they will get a bigger share of the tax cut. I'm sure with that third grade reading guarantee, we're going to follow that up with a fourth grade math guarantee, and everybody will understand that fact one of these days. Them that pays the most will benefit the most when we cut rates. That's just the math. That's not an argument, that's math. And as long as everybody's quoting their favorite president, I would quote mine. It was Ronald Reagan who said, "No poor person ever gave me a job." True statement. Does that mean we're heartless towards the poor? No. It means we're focused on job creation. Job creation. That's what it's all about. That's what it's all about here. And we didn't even ignore or be heartless towards the poor because, as my colleagues have noticed, we put in the earned income tax credit in some form or fashion. Now, admittedly, it's not the form in which the federal government does it, but it's better than what we had a day ago, which was bupkis for a state earned income tax credit. We kept the $20 personal credit for those at the lower end of the income scale, $20 right off their taxes. We kept the homestead exemption for people who are at the fixed income senior level of $30,000 and below. That's not heartless towards the poor. I would ask why Mr. Wexner, the Lindner family, and other big-time folks that are 65 or over, why should they get a property tax credit on their multi-million-dollar mansions? Do they really need it? No. So we're saying that's by the wayside, okay? Mr. Wexner, you can make do without that exemption on the first $25,000 of your real property value. I think he could maybe make it through, okay? Yes, it is true that you can pick any period of time you want, and Ohio is either first in job creation or not first in job creation, but it sort of defies reality. By far and away, the majority of articles I've read has said that the trend in Ohio is going up, all right? Like the old song says, with this budget, ain't no stopping us now, we're on the move. And the programs that we're doing in here for tax reform, for investing in education, are going to keep us on the move. And they're going to continue to grow jobs. And my colleague quoted Governor Rhodes before. I remember his quote a little differently, Senator Olschlager. What good old Jim Rhodes used to always say was, the only thing that matters is who's putting money in here and who's taking money out of here. That's what he used to say. And sure, he said jobs in progress too. Well, for 98.5% of the people in Ohio, we're putting money in here, and I say that's a good deal, so I urge my colleagues to enthusiastically support a very easy budget to support. Thank you. We are codifying a current Secretary of State form, one side of which is the provisional ballot application, the other side of which is a voter registration form. And in order to remove any ambiguity in that form, we are requiring that the provisional ballot form include those 5 simple things that we ask voters to furnish on their absent ballot application. What are they? Let's think about this. How hard is it? Here they are. Your name, your signature, your date of birth, your address, and either your Social Security number or the last 4 digits of your Social Security or your driver's license number. That is what we need in order to register you to vote. That is what we need in order to process your absent ballot. That, too, is what we need in order for you to vote provisionally. The days, ladies and gentlemen, when you could run your campaign in the 2 or 3 weeks prior to Election Day at a reasonable cost are over. By reason of Golden Week and by reason of the extraordinarily generous number of days we allow for early voting prior to the Election Day, your campaigns in a contested election must start much earlier and require more dollars, which then you must raise. And of course, the very good government types who are all for Golden Week are then out the other side of their mouth bemoaning the high cost of elections, the constant whirlwind of fundraisers, the constant axe to grind about raising money. I would think that those caucuses who are outfunded about 10 or 20 to 1 would understand that it actually would be a good thing to eliminate Golden Week so as to make your scarce resources go a little farther, because otherwise you're going to have to start spending those shekels in August and September that you would normally have saved until 2 weeks before Election Day. But I digress. Turn me around on the idea. They passed around yesterday an ad from Macy's in one of the states that does this, okay? And Macy's was advertising, come to our store because you won't have to pay tax on your purchases, all right? Does it work? Are we shifting purchases that might have been made anyway? Is it good to add another deduction or credit or gimmick to the code? But if the retailers think and are willing to put their money behind ads saying, come to our store, this is good for business, they must think it's good for business. Now, maybe that's a reflection on the intellectual level of their customers, because the truth is those Black Friday sales that we see around Thanksgiving give you 20% off or 50% off or 80% off. They're actually much more attractive than saying, come to our store tomorrow because you won't have to pay the sales tax, which, depending on which county you're in, it's either 5.75% or going up to maybe 7.5 or 8 with piggyback taxes. Saving 8% wouldn't get me out of my chair, but, you know, as P.T. Barnum once said, there's one born every minute, and if it doesn't work, why are they advertising and spending countless monies to run big flyers in the Enquirer and the Plain Dealer saying, come down to Macy's on Labor Day and buy your computers and your dresses for school and your pencils and whatever else is covered here? So in the final analysis, I was very, I commend my friend from Cuyahoga County for having done I wish you'd rely on the Tax Foundation more often, Senator. And secondly, we are giving the Board of Elections the discretion by vote of 3 members of the board, so it would require a bipartisan group of folks on the board to agree to excuse people who write down the wrong year. My birthday is October 29th, 1954. If I have a mental lapse and write in October 29th, 2014, they can pretty well figure that I wasn't born yesterday, though many people would say I might have been. And therefore, the Board of Elections would have the discretion by a 3/4 majority to forgive the error in putting down 2014, when in fact it was obvious that it was some earlier date. I wanted to thank Stephen and wish him well in his future pursuits. Stephen, you haven't seen him much here in session because unlike many of the other aides, we keep our aides working in the office. They can watch it on TV as far as I'm concerned. But Stephen, bon voyage, you've been great and we'll miss you. Thank you. Guys in opposition to the amendment. The amendment actually proves what this debate is all about. It isn't about renewable energy or energy efficiency. Both are very benign, wonderful things. But what this bill is about is mandates. They like to talk about standards. Standards. It sounds so nice. It's a standard. It's not a standard. It's a mandate. Whether you want to pay or not, you pay. But I don't want to get all legal on you. I want to explain that there is a very legitimate constitutional issue here, and I've done that. But there's a very practical reason why this amendment is ill-advised. When you create a little part of the sandbox in which you insulate yourself from your competitors, you are able to raise price profitably. And this is indeed what the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio has found steadily each and every year. In-state wind and in-state solar have been found year after year by the PUCO to be more expensive than out-of-state wind and out-of-state solar. And the PUCO's opinion was validated in a study by ICAP United. This is dated November 7th, 2013. My competent citizens groups, like my dear friend Julie Johnson, came up with this one for me, and here it is. Anybody wants to see it? Of course, all this has been shared with the committee in our 51 hours of hearings. So I urge defeat of the amendment, which at least performs the very useful service of reminding us all that this is all about mandates. Mandates on what Bob and Betty have to pay. Mandates. And my mantra is markets work and mandates don't work. Thank you. Because I wasn't going to get into this, but golly, my good friends on the other side of the aisle made so many points, and gee, I just happened to guess that every point they make, I'd be prepared to rebut. So you have to listen to it. Let's take a look at Delaware. Why, Joe Biden loves that. Electricity and peak demand savings equivalent to 15% of 2007 numbers by 2015. How about Illinois, home of Barack Hussein Obama? 2.0% reduction of 2008 electricity sales by 2015. 1.1% reduction of 2000 peak load demand by 2018. Not 22%. They're again having to speak the language that is imposed on them by the commission. And we can get into the weeds for another hour if you want to, but basically bottom line is they're obligated to use a total resource cost test that demands that they compare current costs against projected benefits. So they have to take the current outlay, that's real money, out of your pocket. There it goes, whoop, out of your pocket. And they get to estimate what the benefits are out over time. Sort of like Popeye, where Wimpy said, "Give me a hamburger today for which I will gladly pay you next Tuesday." They're obligated to use a bogus test. They're obligated to use a bogus test. And we can get into the weeds on this, but maybe you'll be lucky and be on the study commission, and you'll know about it as much as I do by the time that's done. I probably can summarize part of this, part of my presentation, by a quote from the May 4th, 2014 Wall Street Journal. Are they quoting the Heartland Institute or ALEC or some nefarious conservative organization? Why, no. They're quoting Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett. You know, he's for the Buffett rule, right? Nobody should pay, everybody should pay as much taxes as their secretary pays, right? The Democrats all love that. He's their hero, right? Very successful businessman, wonderful company, Berkshire Hathaway. And here's what they said. The billionaire was even more explicit about his goal of reducing his company's tax payments. Quote, "I will do anything that is basically covered by the law to reduce Berkshire's tax rate," he said. Quote, "For example, on wind energy, we get a tax credit if we build a lot of wind farms. That's the only reason to build them. They don't make sense without the tax credit." So when we talk about all that private investment, let's talk about whether it's really private investment. And you know what? We did some research, and it isn't. My friend Julie Johnson did some work and dug up a report from the United States House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce, Chairman Fred Upton, dated January 17, 2013. And in this report, they described a little-known federal program called the 1603 Grant Program. I never heard of the 1603 Grant Program, but it's there. And this report from the United States House of Representatives shows, drum roll please, that in the case of Blue Creek Wind Farm, Blue Creek in Ohio, okay, the one that's handing out all the money to the school districts and giving the big rubber checks and smiling and making happy, they got a grant to build the Blue Creek Wind Farm from the federal government of $172,688,076. Now, that's just what they got under the 1603 program, because they also got a 2.4 cent per kilowatt hour credit for every little piece of wind they produce. That's funding their private investment in Ohio. And then, later on in the report, God bless Julie Johnson, God bless Julie Johnson, she points out that the Paulding Wind Farm in Ohio, Paulding Wind Farm, LLC, on November the 4th, 2011, got $369,480 from the federal government under the 1603 program, and they also, of course, get the 2.4 cent per kilowatt hour tax credit. So when we talk about the private investment in Ohio, where they're building these lovely facilities, it's your money, folks. It's your money. It's a big joke. Uncle Sam is doling that money out, and who's paying for that? Either you or me or the Chinese. That's not private investment in this conventional sense of private investment. That's private investment facilitated solely by subsidies. And if you don't believe me, believe Warren Buffett. He's got a few billion more than I do. Companies that make money off mandates want to keep the mandates. Companies that are paying for the mandates don't want the mandates. It's pretty simple. We could have a study commission for 25 years and it wouldn't change that inalterable fact. I can go right down the list, but I'll give you one or two examples in the interest of time. Honda, God bless them, wonderful car manufacturer. They're tremendous. They're great. God love them. Lots of employment in Ohio. They're not for this bill. I'm thinking, that's strange. GM, Ford, and Chrysler are for this bill. What's up with that? Well, we found out. It's a matter of public record. Anybody wants my sheet here, you can call me up. We'll make copies tomorrow if the copy machines work after all the paper got printed today. Okay? Honda buys most of their electric from a rural electric cooperative. Guess what? Rural electric cooperatives are not subject to the mandates. So they get to buy their electric without having to pay for the mandates. And by keeping the mandates, they are able to disadvantage their competitors, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, who buy from investor-owned utilities that are subject to the mandates. Follow the money. And a relaxation massage, nobody's trying to stop that. That's a lawful constitutional pursuit. But when coupled with a promise of sexual activity, that becomes something that ought to be verboten, and we are making it verboten in this bill. That means forbidden for those of you that don't know German. You are voting that if we use tolls as part of the bridge financing plan, we will have automated electronic tolling, because if we didn't, the traffic on that bridge would back up from Cincinnati to Lima or maybe farther north. We could not do it that way. The old school of tolls was best exemplified by Sonny Corleone's unfortunate exercise as he approached the New Jersey Causeway toll booth and was gunned down to death. Or perhaps maybe your favorite alliteration would be Blazing Saddles, where the marauding band rode wildly through the deserted desert only to find an isolated toll booth, and Slim Pickens had to urge his colleagues to turn around and get a bunch of dimes. to pay the toll. In 2006, the House and Senate passed a bill that in most important respects is identical to the bill before you today. It would have banned the use of red light and speed cameras by photoelectric monitoring devices unless a sworn police officer was physically present to witness the violation. That bill, as I say, passed the House and Senate, but as Governor Taft was leaving office, he chose to veto the bill. Flash forward a couple years. I was appearing at a kids voting roast for Governor Taft, and of course left no stone unturned in berating him for his veto of the House Bill 56. He came up to me afterwards and he said, "You know, Bill, when I vetoed that bill, I had people driving me around. Now that I'm driving myself around, I think I agree with you." Those cities claim that these devices have been successful in sharply reducing the number of traffic accidents and in reducing speeds. We found, to our amazement, during the committee proceedings, that the cameras always seem to go up and stay up and never come down. Wouldn't you think that if the cameras were as effective as the municipal folks say they are, that they would say, "Gee, it's worked at the intersection of Gin and Vermouth. Maybe we should move the camera to the intersection of 4th and Main." But that doesn't seem to happen. There's always more cameras put up, and more, which makes some of us cynics, and I pride myself on being such, wonder if it's not all about the money. The cities that use the cameras end up disposing of a disproportionate percentage of the revenues to the camera companies. In Cleveland, upwards of 40% of the total revenue goes to the camera company. As I said to my dear friend Senator Smith while we were hearing the testimony, surely we are in the wrong line of business. When we get out of here, if these things are not sharply regulated, you and I will start a camera company. And we will put up 20 or 30 cameras in some unsuspecting jurisdiction, and we will take 40% of the millions and millions of dollars thereby generated. That in Columbus, for example, something north of 40% of their red light camera revenue comes from folks that are turning right on red at locations at which right on red is allowed. But the all-seeing eye of Big Brother in the camera determines with NFL instant replay accuracy that you did not come to a full and complete stop, and therefore here is your $100 ticket for having violated our ordinance. And I particularly like the bill because for the first time in 6 years, I'll be able to walk outside and enjoy a drink and a cigarette simultaneously. So please vote yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President, for the opportunity to present Senate Bill 361 today. The following presentation has been approved for 10 minutes of continuing legal education credit by the Ohio Supreme Court. Thank you very much. Turn in your forms at the end of session. Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. And Senator Turner, that was quite eloquent. I agree with everything you said. I would note that those lovely gifts are certainly to be appreciated. Just so you know, they probably depleted the entire funding of the Ohio Democratic Senate Campaign Caucus in buying all those lovely candies and graters. So that's quite unselfish on the part of my Senate Democratic friends. We appreciate it. I got myself in a little scrape, and we won't have time to go into all of that right now, but certain people misinterpreted remarks that I said, and it was a great firestorm, and people clamoring for my resignation. Of course, with my typical style, I said, no, we're not doing that. He's received national acclaim for that, deservedly so. It's a walk of over 200 miles that he does every year. I'm truly impressed. The only thing I'd walk a mile for is a camel.